Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel. Continuing with Killer Kids Volume 1. Hopefully I can post the next 3 stories in this video, but we'll see. The next one is Joshua Phillips. Joshua Earl Patrick Phillips was born on March 17, 1984 in Jacksonville, Florida. He was raised in a strict home and grew to be a personable and happy young man. A mediocre student at Philip Randolph Academies of Technology, but a boy who was nonetheless popular with his classmates and considered somewhat of a joker. Like most young boys, he loved sports and was particularly fond of baseball, which he often played with other kids on his block. Not all of Joshua's playmates, though, were boys or even in his age group. One of his regular baseball partners was 8-year-old Maddie Clifton, whose family lived across the street from the Phillips family. Maddie was a happy and outgoing child, a bit of a tomboy, who was the star of her school basketball team, but, like Josh, had a fondness for baseball. The two of them were often seen together, one pitching and the other swinging. Josh's father, in fact, had warned him to stay away from Maddie, saying that the girl was too young to be his playmate, and Josh had complied. His father, Steve, had a temper. Josh did not want to cross him. On the afternoon of November 3rd, 1998, however, temptation was thrown into Josh's path. He'd been up in his bedroom playing on his computer when there was a knock on the door. It was Maddie, and she wanted to play. Josh initially said no, citing his father's warnings and the fact that he still had chores to do. But Maggie was insistent, and eventually she wore him down. Okay, he agreed. We can toss a few pitches in the yard, but then you'll have to go. That was at around 5 p.m. At 6:30 p.m., Maddie's mother, Sheila, called Maddie and her older brother, Jesse, in for dinner. Jessie responded almost right away, but said that she didn't know where her sister was. Mother and daughter then carried out a quick and increasingly frantic search of the neighborhood. Unable to find Maddie, Sheila then ran back to the house and dialed 911. By the time her husband Steve arrived home from work minutes later, units had already been dispatched. Soon a torchlight search was underway, involving police officers and just about everyone in the neighborhood. It would endure throughout the night, but without success. Maddie Clifton appeared to have vanished off the face of the earth. Over the days that followed, the search continued around the clock, while the police started fanning out through the neighborhood, going door to door and asking questions. Had anyone seen the little girl? Had they picked up on anything unusual? Had they noticed any strangers in the neighborhood? Nobody had. Even Joshua Phillips, who had decidedly seen Maddie on the day she disappeared, remained silent. Then, on the morning of November 10th, the mystery of the missing girl was resolved in a way that no one could have foreseen. Josh Phillips had departed for school as usual that day, kissing his mom goodbye before he left to catch the school bus. Missy Phillips then went about her household chores, which included tidying her son's bedroom. Josh had been somewhat reticent about her entering the room lately, but today she was going to have to do it. The space had an odd and unpleasant smell about it. Entering the room, Missy thought that she saw the source of the problem. There was a small puddle at the foot of Josh's waterbed. Perhaps the spilled water was what was causing the stench. Missy grabbed one end of the mattress and peeled it back from the baseboard. Almost immediately, she let it fall back into place and took a step back. Bringing her hand up to her mouth as an involuntary gasp escaped her. Then she was turning and running down the stairs and out into the street, where she found the police officer. What Missy had seen crammed under the mattress was a human foot. It did not take long before police cars were streaming through the quiet Jacksonville neighborhood, some with sirens wailing. Then there were officers stringing up crime scene tape around the Phillips residence to hold back the crowd that had rapidly gathered. Among that crowd was Sheila Clifton, wondering what the ruckus was about and hoping against hope that it did not have anything to do with her daughter. The dreadful truth was confirmed when a police officer tracked her down and ushered her back home. Maddie's body had been found stashed under Joshua Phillips's bed. While CSI units began working the scene, a patrol car was dispatched to Joshua's school with instructions to bring him to a local police station. There, detectives began questioning the boy in the presence of his parents. It was pointless denying involvement in Maddie's death, and Phillips didn't try to. Instead, he concocted a story which the interrogators had difficulty believing. According to Phillips, Maddie had arrived at his door, begging him to play a game of baseball with her. He had eventually agreed, but they'd only been playing a short while when an accident occurred. He'd struck the ball particularly firmly, and it had hit Maddie in the face, opening up a gash above her eye. Maddie had immediately fallen to the ground and started screaming. Phillips had panicked. His father had warned him about playing with the little girl, and now he not only defied that order but had caused the child a serious injury, and his father would be home soon, meaning that he'd be in deep trouble. He therefore decided to pick Maddie up and carry her to his room, hoping that he could calm her down there. But Maddie wasn't to be silenced. Lying on the floor of his bedroom, she again began wailing. His solution was to hit her twice on the head with his baseball bat and then to stab her in the throat with a pocket knife he was carrying. Then, believing she was dead, he pushed her under the mattress. He was just about to leave when Maddie started crying again, so he pulled her out from under the bed and inflicted another knife wound to her throat. Then, as she lay still, he pushed her under the bed and left. Later, he joined in the search for the missing girl, knowing all the while that she was laying dead in his room. Phillips had delivered his version of events with apparent sincerity, but the police already knew that he was lying. The ball that he claimed had hit Maddie in the eye had no traces of blood on it, and there was no blood in the yard where he claimed they'd been playing. The pathologist's report would also fill in the details of Maddie's injuries that Phillips had omitted. She had not been stabbed twice, but 9 times, and she'd been struck on the head, hard enough to fracture her skull. The autopsy had also determined that she'd still been alive when Phillips had pushed her under the bed. The little girl had died in fear and pain. Joshua Phillips was charged with first-degree murder and was tried as an adult. At his trial, held in Polk County, due to massive media coverage of the case, his defense peddled the same story that he'd earlier told the police, but the prosecution was able to provide a far more feasible motive. They believed that this was a sex crime. Even though the autopsy did not reveal any sexual assault, Maddie's body was found nude from the waist down. The police were also able to determine that Phillips had been viewing violent pornographic images online just before the murder, which they believed might have incited him to kill. Maddie's sister, Jessica, had already testified that Phillips had spoken to her and Maddie about sex in the past. In the end, it took the jury just 2 hours to find Joshua Phillips guilty as charged. The judge then handed down the mandatory sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentence was upheld on appeal in 2002. Joshua Phillips is currently incarcerated at the Cross City Correctional Institution in Dixie County, Florida. In 2012, he was handed some hope of one day being released when the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that sentencing juveniles to life without parole is unconstitutional. A new sentencing hearing is pending at this time. Case number 2. Evan Ramsey. On a summer morning in 1986, a man named Don Ramsey walked into the offices of the Anchorage Times in Anchorage, Alaska. Ramsey was heavily armed with an AR-223 semi-automatic assault rifle, a snub-nosed .44 Magnum revolver, and over 200 rounds of ammunition. He was intent on carnage. The editor of this rag had refused to publish a political letter he'd written. Ramsey was going to make him pay for his lack of respect. But Ramsey did not gain the retribution he was after that morning. In fact, he fired neither of his weapons. Instead, he took some hostages, shouted some abuse, and eventually surrendered after a standoff with police. The offense, however, was serious enough to earn him a 10-year prison sentence. The authorities do not take kindly to private citizens brandishing weapons and making threats of violence. And so Don Ramsey's moment of madness landed him behind bars. His sentence, however, would not be suffered alone. It would have a profound effect on those closest to him, his wife and 3 young sons. Already a heavy drinker, Mrs. Ramsey lapsed into alcoholism under the pressure of raising 3 boys alone. Then, after the family home burned down, the Anchorage Department of Youth and Family Services stepped in to remove the boys from their mother's custody. 10-year-old John would be placed with one family, 7-year-old Evan and 5-year-old William with another. Between 1988 and 1991, Evan and William would live in 11 different foster homes. It was hardly a stable environment for the youngsters to grow up in. At several of their placements, the boys suffered physical and sexual abuse. Even Evan, who was a bit slow, got the worst of it. William would later recall how one pair of foster parents had paid the other children in the house to attack him as part of a sick game. Driven to despair by the constant mistreatment, 10-year-old Evan attempted suicide. Then in 1991, there was finally some respite for the brothers when a family named Hart adopted them. Their adoptive mother, Sue, was superintendent of the school district in Bethel, southwestern Alaska. It was several steps up from the foster homes where they'd been living. Bethel is an isolated place with a population of just 5,471 residents. It cannot be reached by road and is in an area so remote that locals call it simply the bush. There is only one junior school, and even Evan and his brother were enrolled there. The next couple of years were probably the happiest of their young lives. But all of that was to change when Evan graduated to Bethel Regional High School. There he quickly became a target for bullies who homed in on his learning disabilities and called him retard or spaz. He was also given the nickname Screech, after a nerdy character in the sitcom Saved by the Bell. Evan was not without friends, though. Among the 450 kids at his school, he was particularly close to 14-year-olds James Randall and Matthew Charles. The trio would often hang out after school when they'd spend hours at the computer game Doom, a role-playing challenge in which the characters stalk and kill each other. Doom was also a favorite of Columbine shooters Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold. When not engaged in the game, Evan and his cohorts would draw up a list of students and teachers they'd like to kill. Top of Evan's list were a couple of ninth graders, a boy and a girl, who constantly tormented him, calling him stupid and spitting in his hair. How did it go from here, from computer games and fantasy hit lists, to an actual school shooting? We may never know. Suffice to say that when Evan first floated the idea, he received enthusiastic backing from his 2 friends. Matthew Charles spoke rapturously about the infamy he'd garner from his act, while James Randall provided more tangible support. He began teaching Evan how to load and fire a 12-gauge pump-action shotgun. All that was needed now was a catalyst. It came after Evan's adoptive mother told him that his father had been released from prison. On the morning of Wednesday, February 19, 1997, Evan Ramsey stepped off the school bus at Bethel Regional High. He was wearing a pair of baggy pants which allowed him to conceal on his person a Mossberg 12-gauge shotgun provided to him by his friend James Randall. Ramsey walked directly to the commons area where over 100 students were gathered. He immediately brandished the shotgun, firing at the boy closest to him, hitting 15-year-old Josh Palacios in the abdomen. As Palacios collapsed to the floor, bleeding from a fatal stomach wound, a scream went up. Then the entire mass of students was in motion, bleeding like a herd of antelope before a large predator. Ramsey fired again, then again, each blast finding its target. but not delivering a fatal shot. Then an extraordinary thing happened. Even as the students were fleeing in panic, Ramsey saw somebody walking towards him. It was art teacher Renee Athens, who had heard the gunshots and had rushed to the commons to find their source. Despite the obvious danger to her own life, the teacher tried to convince Ramsey to lay down his weapon. It is a miracle she wasn't shot. Ramsey, however, was not about to surrender just yet. He had two specific targets in mind, the two ninth graders who were his nemesis. I hated them as much as Hitler hated the Jews, he'd later confess. Ramsey entered the main lobby, walking in the direction that most of the students had fled. The Mossberg was held across his waist, barrel pointing towards the ground, but ready to be brought into a firing position in an instant. When school principal Ron Edwards stepped into his path, Ramsey did not even think. He lifted the shotgun and fired, pumped and fired again. Then, even as Edwards collapsed to the floor, Ramsey turned and walked back into the commons. He sat down on the floor and placed the gun barrel on his chin. That was how the police found him when they arrived moments later. Confronted by the officers, Ramsey said simply, "I don't want to die." Then he laid down his weapon and surrendered. Evan Ramsey was taken into custody. In the meantime, an astonishing detail had emerged about the shooting. It appeared that as many as 20 students had known in advance that it was coming. Many of these individuals had stood on the library balcony overlooking the commons and watched the carnage below. Some had even taken photographs, and yet not one of these kids had informed the authorities or a parent, a move that would have averted the tragedy. And it was two people who were dead. Josh Palacios had been a popular student and a star athlete. Principal Edwards had been a U.S. Marine before taking up a teaching career. Several other kids had been injured in the carnage. Ramsey was going to have to pay for that. On December 2nd, 1998, 16-year-old Evan Ramsey was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder, 3 counts of first-degree attempted murder, and 15 counts of third-degree assault. He was sentenced to 210 years in prison, which was reduced to 2 99-year terms on appeal. Still, Ramsey will be 85 years old before he comes up for parole. He is currently incarcerated at the Spring Creek Correctional Center in Seward, Alaska. Story number 3, and the last one for this video. Austin Sigg. The signs were there for all to see. Clues that all was not right and that trouble lay ahead. But such indicators can be subtle and difficult to interpret. How was one to distinguish between the shy, introverted teen and the budding psychopath, head filled with visions of wanton slaughter? One clue might have been the violent child pornography found on Austin Sigg's computer when he was just 13 years old. That particular indiscretion had earned Sigg a couple of sessions with a psychologist who had beseeched the boy's father to restrict his son's internet access. Whether that advice was ever heeded is uncertain. Fast forward 4 years to 2012, and we find Austin Sigg enrolled in the forensic science program at Arifo Community College in Littleton, Colorado. The obvious intelligent teen had quit school the previous year, driven out by bullies who constantly picked on him because of his high-pitched voice. A high school equivalency test had seen him admitted to college, but even here he remained isolated from his classmates. They found him weird, frighteningly intense, obsessed with death. While most of the forensic students hoped for a career in law enforcement, Austin informed them that he planned on becoming a mortician. But perhaps there was another reason for Austin Sigg's choice of major. Perhaps he thought that a knowledge of police detection techniques would be useful to him in the secondary vocation he was planning. Austin, you see, had never outgrown his childhood fascination with sexual violence. Like most budding psychopaths, he'd spent years nurturing the violent images that circulated in his brain. In his case, those visions centered not on aberrant sex or the act of murder. His particular fetish was for dissection. The thought of having a human body to carve apart and examine instilled in him a feeling of sexual arousal that was almost too intense to bear. Eventually, it drove him to action. On the morning of Monday, May 28, 2012, Sigg got into his Jeep Cherokee and drove to Kenter Lake, near his home in Westminster, Colorado. Concealed with his pocket was a bottle of chloroform, which he'd cooked up using a recipe he found on the internet. His plan was cursory at best. Cursory at best. He was going to conceal himself in bushes beside some isolated path and wait for a lone female to pass by. He'd then come up behind her and clamp a chloroform-soaked rag over her face. After she passed out, he'd drag her into the bushes and rape her. He might even strangle her to death and then cut her. He hadn't decided on that part yet. Sigg didn't have to wait long for a potential victim to appear. He'd barely crouched down in the bushes. He'd barely crouched down in the brush when he spotted a female jogger coming up the path towards him. Steadying his nerves with a couple of deep breaths, he waited until she passed and then broke cover with his chloroform cloth in hand. The woman, however, must have heard him because she turned just as he was about to grab her. A brief struggle then ensued before the potential victim broke free and sprinted away. She later reported the incident to the police. By the time they arrived, Austin Sigg was long gone. Sigg was frustrated but not discouraged by his failure. He realized now that he'd made a crucial mistake in targeting a victim who was strong enough to fight back. What he needed was someone who was easy to overpower. He'd always had a preference for children anyway. Jessica Ridgway was a joy to all who knew her. The fifth grader was a bundle of energy with a mischievous sense of humor and a generally caring nature. She loved the color purple and performing in the Pee Wee cheerleading squad at Witt Elementary. She was on her way to that school on October 5, 2012, when she disappeared. At around 10 a.m. that morning, a school administrator placed a courtesy call to Jessica's mother, wanting to find out if Jessica was okay. Sarah Ridgway, however, did not get the call, as she was asleep, having just returned home from working a night shift. It was only at 4:30 p.m. that she picked up her voicemail and learned that her daughter was missing. She immediately called the Westminster police, but it would be 5 hours before all of the criteria was met to issue an Amber Alert. By then, a massive search was already underway, one that would eventually involve over 1,000 police and civilian volunteers. But as the days passed with no sign of the missing girl, hopes of finding her alive began to appear more and more remote. And the optimism of investigators was not improved when Jessica's backpack was found on a sidewalk in Superior, over 6 miles from her home. That discovery seemed to indicate that Jessica had been abducted. The backpack did, however, provide the Colorado Bureau of Investigation with a piece of evidence that could be checked for trace DNA. They'd only just sent the bag off for processing when they got the news everyone had been dreading. Late on the afternoon of October 11th, 2 municipal workers discovered a heavy garbage bag in Partridge Park open space in Nevada. One of the men split the bag open with his pocket knife and shook its contents out onto the ground. Moments later, the 2 men reeled back in horror. The bag contained the dissected torso of a child. Jessica Ridgway had been found, but her killer was still out there, and a ripple of fear ran through the community. What kind of a monster would murder and mutilate an innocent little girl, and how long before he targeted another child? As concerned parents began escorting their children to and from class, officers guarded crosswalks and photographed cars parked outside schools. Meanwhile, Westminster took on a mantle of purple, as residents adorned their mailboxes and ribbons to honor Jessica. At around that time, the police also issued a public appeal urging citizens to come forward with any information, no matter how trivial. On October 19th, one of them heeded the call. The caller did not have anything tangible to share. All he would say was that the police should talk to Austin Sigg, a local teen who the informant insisted was obsessed with death. On the face of it, that did not seem like a very promising lead, but the police were desperate for a break in the case, and so two CBI agents visited Sigg's residence that same afternoon. The youngster was entirely cooperative, answering questions and agreeing to provide DNA for testing. By the time the agents left with DNA samples in hand, they were convinced that they'd been sent on a fool's errand. But the case was about to take a dramatic turn. On October 23rd, before the results of Sigg's DNA tests were in, a 911 dispatcher in Jefferson County received a most unusual call. The caller identified herself as Mindy Sigg. This is the actual transcript. Mindy Sigg: Hi, I need you to come to my house. My son wants to turn himself in for the Jessica Ridgway murder. Dispatcher: And what's going on there, ma'am? Are you there? Mindy Sigg: Did you not hear me? He just confessed to killing her. Dispatcher: I know. I want you to tell me what's going on. Can you tell me exactly what he said? Mindy Sigg: That he did it and gave me details, and her remains are in my house. The dispatcher then asked if she could speak to Austin directly. Austin Sigg: I don't exactly get why you're asking me these questions. I murdered Jessica Ridgway. Dispatcher: Okay. Austin Sigg: I have proof that I did it. There's no other question. You just have to send a squad car down here. The squad car had, in fact, already been dispatched. When the officers arrived, Sigg was true to his word. He gave himself up without offering any resistance. As a juvenile, he was taken to the Mountain View Services Center, and it was there that detectives began interrogating him. He seemed almost keen to tell his story. Asked why he'd chosen Jessica, Sigg simply shrugged and said that she was at the wrong place at the wrong time. I was just driving and just kind of looking, he said, and I saw her, and I parked and I waited, and as she walked by, and I grabbed her. He said that he'd pulled her into the back seat of his car and had secured her arms and legs with zip ties. He'd then driven around it for a while before taking her back to his house. There he told her to change into some clothes that he'd picked out for her. Then he put on a movie for her to watch while he cut her hair. Finally, he tried to strangle her using a zip tie. When that cut into his hands and failed to provide the right amount of leverage, he resorted to manual strangulation, throttling her for about 3 minutes until she blacked out. But Jessica was still not dead, and as she lay twitching on the floor, Sigg dragged her to the bathroom, filled the tub with scalding hot water, and drowned her in it. He then began dissecting the corpse in the bath, neatly wrapping and labeling the body parts. Some of these he'd later discard. Others, like the head and vagina, he'd keep hidden in the crawl space beneath the house. Asked why he had dismembered the body, Sigg said that he was fulfilling a sexual fantasy. However, he empathetically denied sexually assaulting the 10-year-old. This the medical examiner would determine was a lie. Jessica had indeed been raped. And so Austin Sigg was brought before the Jefferson County District Court in October 2013. Against the advice of counsel, he entered guilty pleas to all of the charges, secure in the knowledge that his age at the time of the murder precluded him from the death penalty. In fact, the mandated sentence for someone of his age was life in prison, with parole eligibility after 40 years. Judge Stephen Monsignor, however, was determined that Sigg should spend the rest of his days behind bars. He sentenced Sigg to an additional 86 years to run consecutively with his life sentence. That means that if Sigg ever earns parole, he will immediately have to begin serving the 86-year term. It is unlikely that he will ever walk the streets again. And that of course is of scant consolation to Jessica Ridgway's grieving family. A monster entered their lives in October 2012, cruelly snatching away a precious little girl for no other reason than to satisfy his perverted needs. To quote a line from Judge Monsignor's closing statement, "Evil is real. It was present in our community on October 5, 2012. On that day, its name was Austin Sigg." Alright guys, and that's the end of this video. Thank you so much for listening. Make sure to share, like, comment, and subscribe. And I'll see you in my next one. Bye.